The night seemed like it had been pulled straight from a dream. The grand riverside mansion glowed with golden lights that spilled across the water, reflecting a world of power and luxury. Expensive cars lined the driveway, their polished exteriors shining under the moonlight. Inside, music filled the halls, crystal glasses clinked, and laughter rang out like a chorus of victory. At the center of it all stood Richard Kingsley, one of the richest men in the country. His fortune had been built on steel, glass, and concrete. He was the man who turned empty land into skyscrapers, the man who carved empires out of cities. To the public, Richard was untouchable, a symbol of wealth and success. Tonight, he was celebrating the biggest deal of his career, a merger worth billions. But behind every smile that surrounded him was a hidden shadow. And Richard, in his arrogance, didn't see it. He moved through the glittering crowd of business partners, investors, and so-called friends, raising his glass to toast after toast. To the future, one of them cheered. To billions more, another added. Richard laughed, the sound confident and full of pride. Yet none of them meant those words the way he thought. They weren't cheering for his success. They were cheering for his downfall. Among them were three men Richard trusted above all: Victor, a longtime advisor; Charles, a lawyer who had handled his finances for years; and Damien, a partner in many of his projects. He believed these men were his brothers in arms, men who had stood by him since the early days when his empire was nothing more than blueprints and borrowed money. But to them, Richard was no longer a friend. He was an obstacle, a man with too much power, too much wealth, and far too much control over their futures. Greed is a quiet poison. It doesn't strike suddenly. It seeps into the heart slowly, twisting loyalty into envy and friendship into betrayal. Tonight, that poison had done its work. As the evening wore on, the party moved to the riverside terrace. The storm clouds above were gathering, yet the men ignored them, continuing their celebration. Richard stepped outside alone for a moment, leaning against the railing to breathe in the cool night air. He closed his eyes, letting the breeze brush against his face. For once, he allowed himself a moment of peace. That's when it happened. The sound of footsteps behind him came too softly for him to react in time. Suddenly, strong hands pressed hard against his back. Richard's eyes flew open in shock. "What the?" he shouted, twisting. But before he could grab hold of the railing, he was shoved forward with brutal force. The world tilted. The golden lights of the mansion spun wildly in his vision. His scream was swallowed by the wind and the raging water below. Then, splash! The icy river closed over him like a coffin. Panic shot through Richard's veins as he struggled against the current. The water was merciless, dragging him down, filling his lungs with burning cold. He tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped his mouth. His expensive suit weighed him down like chains, pulling him deeper. On the terrace above, three silhouettes stood in silence. Victor, Charles, Damien. They did not call for help. They did not throw a rope. Instead, they leaned on the railing, watching. "He won't make it out," Victor muttered. Charles smirked. "Good. When he's gone, so is his empire. We'll divide it all." Damien nodded, though his eyes flickered nervously toward the dark waters. "No one will suspect us. Everyone will think it was an accident. The storm will cover everything." The three men raised their glasses one last time, not to Richard, but to themselves. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, Richard's world was unraveling. Memories flashed before him like a cruel slideshow. His late father teaching him about hard work, the day he bought his first skyscraper, the people who had cheered for his success. And now, this was how it ended? Alone, betrayed, sinking into a river that showed no mercy. His chest ached, his body screamed for air. He fought, kicking, clawing, his hands reaching desperately toward the faint shimmer of moonlight above the waves. But the river was strong, pulling him under again and again, like a predator refusing to release its prey. Richard's mind screamed in denial. He was Richard Kingsley, billionaire, builder of empires, a man who had conquered cities. How could this be the way he died? Helpless, powerless, discarded like nothing. The betrayal cut deeper than the water filling his lungs. The people he trusted most, the men he had lifted to power, had thrown him to his death for money. The realization broke something inside him. His body grew weaker. His arms slowed. The shimmering surface above him began to blur, fading into darkness. For the first time in his life, Richard felt the icy touch of defeat. The thought of never rising again, of being forgotten, his empire devoured by vultures, haunted him as the water dragged him further down. His last conscious thought was not of his billions, not of his skyscrapers or success. It was of loneliness. For all his wealth, in this moment, there was no one to reach out a hand and save him. No one. Or so he thought. For while his friends celebrated his death and the river tried to claim his life, fate was moving in silence along the banks. A humble maid named Grace, who had nothing but her strength and her heart, was about to change everything. And the story of Richard Kingsley was only just beginning. The storm raged on, drumming against the earth like angry fists. Rain fell in sheets, pelting the ground and turning the dirt paths into rivers of mud. The river itself roared louder than usual, swollen with the downpour, its black waters twisting and thrashing like a beast unchained on the outskirts of the city. Far from the shining towers that men like Richard Kingsley had built, there stood a cluster of wooden huts. Their roofs leaked, their walls sagged, and yet inside them, lives were lived with quiet strength. In one of those huts lived Grace. Grace was not a woman of wealth, nor power, nor status. She was a maid. Her days were spent scrubbing floors until her knees ached, polishing furniture that didn't belong to her, and washing clothes for families who barely noticed her existence. Her hands were calloused, her back bent, her spirit tested every single day. Yet through it all, she endured, because she had two children who depended on her, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6. They were the reason she worked herself to the bone. They were the reason she endured hunger when there wasn't enough food. They were the reason she still found a smile in the darkness of life. That night, with the storm pressing down on her little home, Grace tied her headscarf tightly and stepped out with an old bucket in hand. The roof was leaking again, dripping into the small room where her children huddled beneath a blanket. She needed water, for cooking, for washing, for life. Even in the storm, her chores did not stop. Most people would have been too afraid to go near the river when it was this wild. But Grace was no stranger to danger. She had walked this path hundreds of times. She knew the stones beneath her feet, the bend of the trees, the way the moonlight usually glimmered on the surface of the water. Tonight, however, everything was different. The storm had swallowed the moon, and the river was no gentle stream. It was a monster, thrashing and growling as if eager to devour anyone foolish enough to approach. Still, Grace pressed forward. Her children needed her as she neared the riverbank. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the water for a brief moment. That was when she saw it first. It looked like debris. A log, perhaps, tossed by the raging current. But something about the shape made her heart stop. It was too rigid, too human. Her eyes widened. She blinked, convinced her imagination was playing tricks on her. But then another flash of lightning came, and this time, she saw clearly. An arm, pale against the darkness of the water, a man's body drifting helplessly downstream. Her heart leapt into her throat. "No," she whispered, clutching her chest. For a second, fear froze her in place. The river was violent, unforgiving. If she went in, she could drown too. But then, she thought of her children. She thought of what she always taught them. We must help others, even when it is hard. Could she really walk away and let a man die, knowing she could have tried? Grace dropped her bucket with a clatter and ran to the edge. The man was slipping further away with each passing second, swallowed by waves. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She tore off her scarf, kicked off her worn shoes, and without another thought, leapt into the river. The cold struck her like knives. The water roared around her, pulling, pushing, tossing her like a rag doll. She gasped, choking as the current tried to drag her under. But she fought back, forcing her body forward with powerful strokes. Her muscles screamed in protest, but her heart told her to push harder. "Hold on," she shouted, though the man was too far gone to hear. Her voice was lost to the storm. She swam with every ounce of strength, her eyes locked on the lifeless figure bobbing in the water. At times, the current pulled him out of sight, burying him beneath the waves, and her chest clenched in panic, fearing he was gone. But then he would resurface, and hope surged through her veins. Finally, her fingers brushed against fabric, his suit jacket, waterlogged and heavy. With a cry of effort, she grabbed him, wrapping her arm firmly around his chest. He was limp, unconscious, his face pale as the moon hidden behind the clouds. His body felt like dead weight, dragging her down. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would both sink. No, Grace screamed against the storm, refusing to let go. Not tonight. Not while I still have breath. Kicking with her legs, she fought to turn back toward the shore. The river resisted, slamming against her, pulling at her, trying to tear him away. But Grace was relentless. She clawed at the water, inch by inch, her lungs burning, her body trembling. Her strength was fading, but her will was unbreakable. She thought of her children's faces, of their innocent eyes. If this man died, he would leave behind loved ones too, family, friends, people who would mourn him. She couldn't let that happen to at last. Her feet brushed against the muddy bottom of the riverbank. Summoning the last of her strength, she dragged the man upward, stumbling and slipping until they collapsed onto the shore. She fell to her knees beside him, gasping for air, her body shaking violently from exhaustion. The man lay motionless. His chest did not rise. No, no, no. Grace whispered frantically, pressing her hands to his chest. She had no training in medicine, no fancy knowledge, but she refused to give up. She pushed against him, begging, "Breathe. Please, just breathe." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, water gushed from his mouth as he coughed violently, choking and gasping for air. His chest rose and fell, weak but alive. Grace let out a sob of relief, tears mingling with the rain on her face. She had done it. She had saved him. As the storm raged on around them, Grace looked down at the stranger she had pulled from death's grip. His suit, though ruined by the river, was clearly of fine quality, nothing a poor man would ever wear. His hands were smooth, untouched by hard labor. He was someone important, someone far from her world of scrubbing and toil, but none of that mattered to Grace. To her, he wasn't a billionaire, a businessman, or a man of status. He was just a life worth saving. And though she did not know it yet, this single act of courage would change her life, and his, forever. The storm finally eased by dawn. The rain quieted to a soft drizzle, and the river, though still swollen and fierce, no longer screamed with the fury of the night. The world looked washed clean, though in Grace's little hut, the weight of exhaustion was heavy. Inside, the dim glow of an oil lamp cast shadows across the wooden walls. The air smelled faintly of herbs, damp clothes, and smoke from a tiny fire she had struggled to keep alive all night. On the narrow bed, nothing more than a wooden frame and a thin mattress, lay the man she had dragged from death itself. His face was pale, his lips cracked, his hair still damp despite the blanket she had wrapped around him. Grace sat on a small stool beside him, her elbows on her knees, her hands clasped tightly as she watched his chest rise and fall. Each breath reassured her he was still alive. Each pause between breaths made her heart stop in fear. She hadn't slept at all. She had spent the night tending to him, drying his clothes by the fire, changing wet cloths on his forehead, whispering silent prayers into the darkness. Who was he? She didn't know, but that didn't matter. To her, he was a man who had been left to die, and she couldn't stand by and let that happen. Hours passed. The storm moved on. The morning sun peeked shyly through the clouds, and still the stranger remained unconscious. Grace's two children peeked from the corner where they had huddled together, their wide eyes full of curiosity. "Mama, is he dead?" her little daughter whispered. Grace shook her head. "No, baby. He's alive, and we're going to help him get better." "But who is he?" her son asked. Grace hesitated. She looked at the man's suit. It was torn and waterlogged, but clearly expensive, far beyond anything a poor laborer or farmer would own. His watch, though damaged by the water, still gleamed faintly with the kind of wealth she had only seen in the homes she cleaned. Whoever this man was, he came from a world far different from theirs. I don't know, she admitted softly. But sometimes it doesn't matter who a person is. Sometimes what matters is what we choose to do when we see someone in need. The boy frowned, but nodded slowly, trusting his mother's words. Then, just as Grace began to doze off in her chair, she heard it, a faint groan. Her eyes snapped open. The stranger's eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitching against the blanket. His lips parted, releasing a weak, broken sound. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. He blinked, confusion clouding his gaze as he looked around the dim room. His breathing quickened, and he tried to push himself up, but his body was too weak. Panic spread across his face. Where am I? His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Grace leaned forward quickly, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. You're safe, she said softly. Please, don't move too much. You almost drowned. His eyes darted to her, narrowing as he struggled to understand. The last thing he remembered was water crashing over him, the feeling of death pulling him under. And now he was alive? In a place he didn't recognize? You pulled me out? He croaked. Yes. Grace nodded, her expression calm but firm. I found you in the river. You were unconscious. I brought you here. The man stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words refused to come. Finally, he whispered, Why? Grace frowned, confused. Why? Because you were drowning. Because you're a human being, and I couldn't let you die. Her words struck him harder than she realized. Richard Kingsley, though Grace did not yet know his name, was a man who lived in a world where every action had a price, every favor a hidden cost. People helped him for money, for power, for what they could gain. But here was a woman, a maid in a tiny hut, who had risked her life for him without even knowing who he was. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, something he had long forgotten. Gratitude that he swallowed hard, still trembling. His voice cracked as he asked, What is this place? My home, Grace answered simply. She gestured around the small room. It isn't much, but it kept you warm through the night. Richard's eyes scanned the hut. He noticed the patched walls, the leaky roof, the tiny fire that barely held its flame. He noticed her children watching him shyly from the corner, their clothes worn but clean. He realized this woman had almost nothing, yet she had given everything she could to save him. I don't understand, he murmured. You don't even know me. Grace gave a small, tired smile. I don't need to know you to save you. Those words echoed in his mind, cutting deeper than she could imagine. For Richard, who had spent his life surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was and treated him according to his wealth, this moment was something he couldn't comprehend. Here, stripped of his billions, his titles, his power, he was just a man. And for the first time, someone had looked at him that way. That he tried to speak again, but exhaustion overtook him. His eyes closed, his body sinking back into the thin mattress. Grace tucked the blanket tighter around him, her hands steady, her heart full of quiet determination. You rest now, she whispered. You're safe here. I'll take care of you. For the next few days, Richard drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he woke in panic, haunted by flashes of betrayal, the push, the water, the faces of men he once trusted. Other times, he woke to find Grace gently wiping his brow with a damp cloth, or her children peeking curiously at him with wide eyes. Each time, she reassured him, calmed him, reminded him he was not alone. And slowly, he began to realize that this woman, this maid who had nothing, was the only person in the world he could trust. The days following Richard's rescue passed slowly, each one blurring into the next. The storm had cleared, but inside Grace's small hut, the atmosphere remained heavy with struggle. Richard was alive, yes, but far from strong. His body bore the toll of his near death. Weakness clung to him. Fever visited in waves, and nightmares plagued his sleep. Grace remained by his side through it all. She cooked thin soups from whatever she could spare, using scraps of vegetables and grains. She boiled herbs her grandmother had once taught her to use for fevers. And when he tossed and turned in the grip of dreams, She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and whispered soothing words. For Richard, the experience was both humbling and bewildering. He had lived his entire life surrounded by wealth. Doctors at his call, luxury at his fingertips, staff trained to anticipate his every need. Yet here he was, utterly dependent on a woman who had nothing, a woman who gave freely without expecting a thing in return. At first, Richard struggled with the simplicity around him. The bed was hard, the room cramped, the food plain. But as the days passed, something began to shift inside him. He noticed the quiet sacrifices Grace made, skipping meals so he could eat, stitching torn clothes by candlelight, checking on her children even when her own body screamed with exhaustion. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Richard found the strength to sit up in bed. Grace was tending the fire, stirring a pot of soup. Her children sat nearby, working on their small slate boards, practicing letters by the fading light. "Grace," Richard said, his voice still rough but steadier than before. She turned, surprised to see him awake. "You should be resting," she said, moving quickly to his side. "I've been resting too much," he replied with a weak smile. "You've done so much for me. I need to thank you." Grace shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." But Richard's gaze lingered on her. "No, not anyone. Not in a world where people step over the suffering to save themselves. You risked your life for me." "What?" Her eyes softened. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Because I know what it's like to be helpless. To feel like no one cares whether you live or die. I couldn't let you be swallowed by that river. Not while I had the strength to fight for you." Richard felt her words cut deep. He thought of his so-called friends, the ones who had pushed him into the water, the ones who had raised glasses to his death. And then he thought of Grace, who owed him nothing, yet gave him everything she could. The contrast was staggering. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Richard asked, "Grace, do you ever wish for more? A different life?" Grace smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her tired eyes. "Of course. Who doesn't? But wishing doesn't feed my children. Wishing doesn't put a roof over our heads. So I work. I do what I must. That's enough for me." Her words humbled him. Here was a woman who carried burdens heavier than he had ever known, yet she bore them with grace and quiet strength. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She simply endured. The days continued, and Richard grew stronger. Soon he could walk across the small room without collapsing. Grace's children warmed to him, curious about the man their mother had saved. One afternoon, the little girl brought him a small flower she had picked by the river. "For you," she said shyly, placing it in his hand. Richard's throat tightened. He had received countless expensive gifts in his life: gold watches, designer suits, luxury cars. But this simple flower, given with innocent kindness, touched him in a way nothing else had. That night, as Grace sat by the fire, Richard spoke again. "You've shown me something I've forgotten. Something no amount of money could buy." Grace looked up from her sewing. "What's that?" "Love," Richard whispered. "Not the romantic kind. The kind that asks for nothing in return. The kind that gives because it's right." Grace lowered her gaze, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Love doesn't cost anything," she said softly. "But it's the hardest thing to give when the world has taken so much from you. Still, it's all I have left to give my children. And maybe to you too." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had spent years chasing billions, building skyscrapers, surrounding himself with wealth. But in this small hut, with its cracked walls and flickering light, he realized he was richer than he had ever been before. Every night, as he lay on the hard mattress, he thought about his life, his empire, his betrayal, his near death. And each time, his thoughts circled back to Grace. Her strength, her humility, her compassion. He wondered how many people like her existed in the world. People whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose hearts carried more value than gold. One evening, as the rain tapped gently against the roof, Richard whispered, "Grace, you've given me more than life. You've given me a reason to live differently." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Don't thank me, Richard. If you've been given another chance, use it. Don't waste it on the things that nearly destroyed you. Her words echoed in his mind long after she had spoken them. He knew then that his life would never return to what it once was. The river had not only nearly taken his life, it had washed away his blindness, his arrogance, his obsession with wealth. And in its place, Grace had shown him a truth he could never forget. Their bond, born in hardship, was unshakable. Richard was no longer just a billionaire fighting for survival. He was a man who had been saved not by his wealth, but by the courage of a maid who had nothing but love to give. And though neither of them could see the future, both felt in their hearts that fate had tied them together for a reason far greater than either could imagine. By the time Richard's strength had fully returned, several weeks had passed. The hut that had once seemed so foreign to him now felt strangely like a sanctuary. The simplicity, the warmth of Grace's care, and the innocent laughter of her children had begun to mend wounds far deeper than the ones the river had left on his body. But there was one wound Grace knew nothing about. The wound of betrayal that haunted Richard every night when he closed his eyes. He could still see their faces, Victor, Charles, and Damien, the men he had trusted most. The men who had eaten at his table, toasted to his success, and sworn loyalty to him. And yet, they had been the ones who shoved him into the river, letting the current drag him toward death. Richard often awoke drenched in sweat, gasping for air as though the water was still in his lungs. Sometimes he jolted awake with a cry, startling Grace, who would rush to his side with a damp cloth and soothing words. But even her gentle touch couldn't erase the storm inside him. One evening, as the sky turned crimson with the setting sun, Richard sat outside the hut for the first time since his rescue. His body was stronger now, but his soul felt heavier than ever. Grace joined him, carrying a small basket of laundry she had just finished scrubbing by hand. She set it aside and sat quietly beside him. Waiting, Richard stared at the horizon for a long time before speaking. "Grace, there's something I haven't told you. Something I can't keep inside any longer." Grace tilted her head, sensing the gravity in his voice. "What is it?" He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "My name isn't just Richard. It's Richard Kingsley." Grace blinked, confused. The name meant nothing to her at first. She only knew him as the man she had pulled from the river, the man who had become part of her small world. But then, like a faint bell in her memory, she remembered hearing the name on the radio once. The billionaire, the man who built skyscrapers and owned half the city. Her eyes widened. "You mean the Richard Kingsley?" "The billionaire?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Yes, that's me. Or at least it used to be." Grace sat in stunned silence. She looked around her humble hut, then back at him. The contrast was staggering. A billionaire, lying on her simple bed, eating her plain soups, wrapped in the same blanket she used for her children when the nights were cold. It was almost unbelievable, but Richard's eyes held no pride, no arrogance. Only pain. "Why were you in the river?" Grace finally asked, her voice trembling. "Men like you don't just end up drowning in the middle of the night." Richard closed his eyes, and the memories came rushing back. The laughter of the party, the weight of the shove, the cold embrace of the water. His hands clenched into fists. "I was betrayed," he said bitterly, "by the men I trusted most. My partners, my friends. We had just closed the biggest deal of my career. Billions were at stake. But for them, my life was worth less than their greed. They pushed me into the river, Grace. They tried to erase me, to steal everything I had built." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had known cruelty in life, but this was something darker. To murder a man for money, to betray someone who had trusted you. That was a wound no medicine could heal. That Richard's voice broke as he continued. "I thought wealth would protect me. I thought loyalty could be bought with generosity. But I was a fool. All I built, all the billions I earned, it made me blind. I surrounded myself with vultures who smiled while they sharpened their knives." His words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Grace felt her chest ache for him. She had known betrayal in her own way, her husband abandoning her, leaving her to raise 2 children alone. But what Richard described was betrayal on a scale she couldn't imagine. After a long silence, Grace reached out and placed her hand gently on his trembling one. "Money makes people do terrible things," she said softly. "But it doesn't mean money is evil. It's what people choose to do with it that matters." Richard looked at her, his eyes glistening. "And what should I do, Grace? Everything I worked for, everything I believed in, it's all tainted. How can I go back to that world knowing the people closest to me wanted me dead?" Grace's grip tightened, her voice steady despite the pain she saw in him. "Then don't go back to it the same way. If life gave you another chance, use it. Don't waste it on chasing more billions. Use what you have to do good, to make a difference, to build something that can't be destroyed by greed." Her words hit him harder than any betrayal ever had. Here was a woman with nothing, no wealth, no power, no safety net, and yet she spoke of money not with envy, but with wisdom. She didn't ask him for riches, she didn't beg for favors. She simply reminded him of responsibility. To Richard's throat tightened, and tears filled his eyes. "You saved my life, Grace. Not just from the river, but from myself. All my wealth blinded me to what really matters. But you've shown me that love, compassion, and sacrifice are worth more than any fortune." Grace smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Love doesn't make us rich, Richard, but it makes us human. And sometimes that's enough." For a long time, they sat together in silence, watching the last light of the sun fade into darkness. The truth had been revealed. Richard was no longer just a stranger she had saved. He was a billionaire, a man whose name echoed through the city. But to Grace, he was still the man she had pulled from the river, the man who ate her plain soup and listened to her children's laughter. And for Richard, Grace was no longer just a maid. She was the reason he was alive, the reason he now saw the world with new eyes. The betrayal of his so-called friends still burned inside him, but Grace's words planted a seed. Perhaps his billions weren't meant to be weapons in the hands of the greedy. Perhaps they could become tools of change, if he was willing to use them differently. The night settled around them, quiet and heavy. And in that silence, Richard made a vow, not just to himself, but to the woman who had saved him. His life would never be the same again. The days that followed Richard's confession to Grace felt different. A weight had been lifted, yet another had taken its place. Now that she knew the truth, Richard could no longer hide from the inevitable. His past was waiting for him, demanding to be confronted, but he wasn't the same man who had nearly drowned weeks before. Something had shifted. His brush with death, Grace's selfless kindness, and the betrayal he had endured had reshaped him. He was no longer blinded by the hunger for more billions. He now understood that life itself, fragile and fleeting, was the greatest treasure. Still, there was unfinished business. One morning, as the children played outside, Richard stood by the doorway of the hut. The sunlight touched his face, and for the first time in weeks, he stood tall. His posture was not of a broken man, but of someone who had reclaimed his strength. "I can't hide here forever," he said quietly. Grace, who was stirring a pot over the fire, turned to him. "You don't have to go back," she said gently. "Those men, they're dangerous. They could hurt you again." Richard nodded. "I know, but if I don't face them, they win. And everything you taught me, all the second chances I've been given, will mean nothing. I have to fight back, not with fists or hatred, but with truth, with justice." Grace studied him, her heart heavy. Part of her wanted to beg him to stay, to remain in their little world where life was simple and safe. But she also knew she couldn't cage him. He had a destiny, and perhaps saving his life meant giving him the courage to live it fully. "Then promise me something," she said softly. "Promise me you won't let anger destroy you. You're not like them, Richard. Don't become what you hate." Her words cut deep, and he nodded solemnly. "I promise." A week later, Richard left the riverside village. Grace watched from the path as he walked away, her children clutching at her skirt, waving goodbye. He carried nothing but the clothes she had given him and the strength she had poured into him through her kindness. The journey back to the city was long and harsh, but Richard endured it. And when he finally stepped into civilization again, it was as though a ghost had returned from the grave. News outlets had already declared him missing, presumed dead. His business empire was in turmoil. His loyal partners, Victor, Charles, and Damien, had stepped in as interim leaders, consolidating power, spinning lies, and quietly preparing to claim full ownership. When Richard walked through the doors of his headquarters, gasps filled the room. Employees froze. Some whispered his name in disbelief. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if they were seeing a phantom. And when his betrayers entered the boardroom, their smug expressions shattered. "You," Victor stammered, his face draining of color. Richard stood tall, his voice steady. "Surprised to see me? I suppose you thought the river had swallowed me whole." Charles tried to recover quickly. "Richard, this is unbelievable. We thought you were gone." "Don't," Richard cut in sharply, his eyes blazing. "Don't insult me with your lies. I know what you did. The shove, the water, the betrayal." Damien sneered, trying to mask his fear. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against ours." Richard stepped closer, his voice low but full of power. "You're right. I don't have proof of that night. But what I do have is proof of your corruption, your fraud, your theft while I was gone. You've been sloppy, gentlemen. Very sloppy." He tossed a thick folder on the table. Weeks of investigation, gathered by the few employees who had remained loyal to him, spilled out in black and white evidence. Accounts, secret transfers, deals signed behind his back. The room was silent except for the rustling of papers. The betrayers' faces twisted with panic. "This company was built with integrity," Richard said firmly, "and I won't let it be poisoned by greed. You tried to bury me, but I rose again. And now, justice will bury you." The aftermath was swift and merciless. Authorities were brought in. Charges were filed. Victor, Charles, and Damien were arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Though the river crime couldn't be pinned on them legally, their downfall was total. Richard didn't celebrate their arrest with glee. There was no victory dance, no smugness. Instead, there was quiet sorrow. These had been men he once called brothers. Their betrayal hurt not because they had failed as enemies, but because they had failed as friends. And yet, there was closure. The chapter of betrayal was ending. But what came next was even more shocking. The world expected Richard Kingsley to return to his empire with vengeance, to double his wealth, to rebuild bigger and stronger. Instead, he stunned everyone that he began liquidating large portions of his holdings, not recklessly, but purposefully. He created foundations, schools, and medical clinics. He invested in communities that had been forgotten, especially those like Grace's Riverside Village. When reporters asked him why, his answer was simple: "Because I've seen what money can do in the wrong hands. And I've seen what kindness can do in the right hands. I choose kindness." Months later, Richard returned to Grace's hut, not as a broken man, but as someone reborn. Her children ran to him, laughing, clinging to his legs. Grace stood at the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise. "You came back," she whispered. Richard smiled. "I promised myself I would." He handed her a small envelope. Inside were documents, legal ownership papers of a new house, fully paid for, in a safe neighborhood, a scholarship fund for her children, a salary for her, not as a maid, but as the manager of one of his new community centers. Grace's hands shook as she held the papers. "Richard, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," he said gently. "You gave me life when I had nothing to give in return. This is not charity. This is gratitude. Without you, there would be no Richard Kingsley. And now, the world will know that a maid saved a billionaire, not just from drowning, but from himself." Tears rolled down Grace's cheeks. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need words. As Richard looked around at the humble hut one last time, he realized it wasn't just the river that had tested him. It was fate. And through Grace's compassion, he had found redemption. The world would still call him a billionaire. But he knew the truth. His real wealth wasn't in his bank accounts or skyscrapers. It was in the second chance he had been given, in the trust of the woman who had saved him, and in the lives he could now touch. Richard Kingsley had been thrown into the river for billions. But it was a black maid's love and humanity that pulled him back, and for the rest of his life, he vowed to honor that gift.